One second. All right. All right. So, well, thank you so much for doing this. I've
Yeah, my
been
pleasure.
been reading your book, How Enlightenment Changes the Brain.
Oh, good.
Yeah, fascinating. Absolutely
Oh,
love
thank
it.
you.
Yeah, so cool. Um, yeah, I love how you put in your personal story and and then how that branches out into all these different quotes, how enlightenment has affected culture in the past.
Right. Yeah, it's quite fascinating. I mean, it's amazing to me how complex it is and how diverse it is. But I guess that's what I always come to realize in many ways.
It's also so unique to talk to a scientist who studies enlightenment. And
Right.
the other day I was
That
sitting,
makes me a bit of a rare breed.
yeah,
Yes.
right. The other day I was talking to a friend and I was trying to describe to him what you do, and I was like, I guess you could call him an enlightenment scientist. But I
Somebody,
guess technically you're a
one of my
neuroscientist,
favorite lines, somebody said I was a guru of gurus. So,
right? Studying gurus.
something like that.
Yeah, your test subjects are gurus.
That's right.
Um, but technically you're a neuroscientist, right?
Yeah, I think that's the best way to introduce me. It's actually a little. I mean, I do a lot of neuroimaging, and my background is really medicine and neuroimaging. But I think that kind of neuroscientist is sort of the easiest way to say it.
Hmm. And where did you go to school?
I went to the University of Pennsylvania for medical school, and then I worked at Penn for about 10 years, and then I moved over to Jefferson, which is in Philadelphia as well, and we have a center for integrative medicine here, and it's been great since, and I've been here about 7, 8 years now, and doing a
And
lot of interesting things, so it's fun.
is that where you did your PhD?
Well, I don't have a PhD, I have an MD.
Ah, okay.
Uh,
But
I'm a medical doctor,
that's where you did
so
it.
I did it at Penn.
Yeah.
I did it at the University of Pennsylvania. So, and I went to undergraduate college at a small school called Haverford College, which is outside of Philadelphia, and a very nice liberal arts, small school. That is where I started to
Mm.
take classes on Buddhist thought and Hindu thought and all that kind of good stuff. So, it started me in the direction.
So what I'm interested in is the resistance you must have faced trying to bridge the gap between medicine and spirituality,
Uh-huh.
and also the gap between empirical knowledge and subjective experience.
Sure.
So I guess let's start with the question: is there a scientific theory for enlightenment?
Well, I think that there is something that science can say about enlightenment. I don't think, I certainly don't think that science has is the end all and be all of understanding enlightenment. As you mentioned, there's clearly the subjective psychological component that's fundamental to the experience.
Right.
But science can definitely tell us about the experience. It can tell us about the physiology of what's happening inside of our brain or our body, and I think that helps us to learn something about it. I sometimes liken it to the analogy of trying to study a boat by looking at its wake. I mean, you can't learn everything about it, but you can learn some things about it. You can
Right.
learn maybe how fast it's going. You can learn how big it is. So, when it comes to enlightenment, we may not be able to learn everything that we can from using science, but we can learn things about it. We can learn about its impact on us. How does it change us? How does it change our brain? How does it change our body? And in that regard, I think there's still a lot for us to learn, and I think it's relevant information too, because it helps us to understand not only what's going on inside of us, but how those experiences arise. Are there pathways to that experience that might be more effective than others? Can we learn something about how these experiences might ultimately help humanity in a larger perspective, and
Mm.
maybe making us more compassionate, more understanding, more open to other ideas, other beliefs, and so forth. So all of that kind of comes into play. It ranges anywhere from very sort of practical elements to some of the esoteric aspects of what does enlightenment really mean. And you can ask the question, if a person is enlightened, what part of them is enlightened? Is it just their spirit or their soul? Is it their mind and brain? Is it their body? Is it everything? How
Right.
do we think
And
about
then the
all of that?
question, like, what is the difference between soul and mind and
Oh,
spirits?
absolutely.
And
And
are those
consciousness.
things neurological processes in the brain? Does consciousness come from beyond the brain?
Absolutely. And
Mm.
again, I think part of what I try to advocate for is the notion of how we can use science to address questions that before were purely philosophical or purely theological. So, I mean, up until
Right.
30 years ago, enlightenment was if you had the enlightenment experience. Spirituality was how you felt. Religiousness was your belief in God and a faith in the Bible or the Quran or something like that. Um, but now we have an opportunity to understand these things, and part of what science means is not just looking at biology or doing brain scans, but a sort of systematic approach to understanding something. So, in our book, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, to me, one of the real central pieces of that is a survey where we said, we're not going to just look at what Buddha had to say about enlightenment or what
Hmm.
you know
Yeah.
what great spiritual leader had to say about it. We want to know what people think about it. What does it mean to them? How do they define it? And so when you get to questions about the soul or about the mind, when we say the soul, yeah, I can look at a theologian, I can look at Thomas Aquinas and ask what did he say about the soul. I can look at the various religious groups, like the Catholic Church, and what do they say about what the soul is. But I can also go around and ask every individual person, how do you define your soul? How do you define your spirituality? And see, where the similarities are, where the differences are. What if we think that Buddha described enlightenment perfectly, and then we go and ask everybody who feels they've been enlightened what it was like, and no one says it had anything to do with what Buddha had to say. I mean,
Right.
so there's a lot of interesting things that come about if we start to look at this from a bit of a systematic, scientific approach. And then, of course, when you add in the other aspect of, well, what's going on in the brain when somebody meditates or prays or has some enlightenment experience? Does that tell us something about the nature of the experience and the qualities of it? How does it link up with what the person experiences inside of their mind? So I think there's a lot for us to learn, and I think taking this kind of approach can ultimately be very, very positive in helping us figure
Mm.
this out. Ultimately, helping us figure out who we are,
Yeah,
as human
I think
beings.
it
That's what.
also it takes enlightenment off the pedestal and puts it in the hands of everyday people.
That's right. That's right.
Because often, it's like, oh, it's like only these people, only these prophets have experienced enlightenment, but breaking down enlightenment to sort of these ingredients that actually a lot of people do experience.
Right.
Uh, I love that example you gave of the truck driver who suddenly was
That's always
helping
my favorite one. Yeah.
moving his friend's furniture, and suddenly the boundaries between everything was dissolving,
Right.
right? And he isn't gonna go around like claiming to be a prophet, right? But
That's
there's
right.
so many people that are having these profound enlightening experiences, and yeah, I think it's nice to sort of democratize enlightenment.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, right. I mean, I think to me, one of the key take home points, looking at this group, this survey, and a couple thousand people, and truck drivers, and just everyday regular people, is it can happen to everyone. Obviously, that's not never a guarantee, but it's not like you have to be, Mother Teresa, or you have to be some, Buddhist monk sitting up on a mountainside somewhere. But it really can happen to virtually
Mm.
anyone, and it's a matter of the right circumstances. Sometimes it is a lightning bolt out of the sky that just kind of hits you, and if that happens, well, maybe you're fortunate. But a lot of people can achieve it through
and
other
work
means,
and
and
work towards it.
work towards it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. For me personally, it was like I had like one mind-shattering experience at a meditation retreat.
Hmm.
That sort of it was almost like my soul. I saw everything from the perspective of this eternal being, and this life was not only like a tiny little thing I was doing.
Right.
But then there was also this huge disharmony between all the beliefs I had accumulated that were in opposition to that mindset.
Right.
And that sort of created a personal struggle with, like, I'd say my old self, or the self that identified as a material being, and then this other part that just was infinitely present. and
Hmm.
and those two parts were sort of like going like this for a while. And and now I still do my daily meditations, and I feel like I hit like waves where I'm just floating and accepting all that is. And then, I get into some sort of trigger where some personality part comes back, and I sort of go back into conflicting emotions. And
Right.
and so I don't know. I mean, I guess some people, for them, it's like they get hit by lightning and it's just permanent and no returning ever to the old self.
Right.
But I guess for me, there's still like some parts of me that are still attached to the
Hmm.
lessons that I'm learning here, or still
Right.
haven't.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, and I mean everybody ultimately has to find a way of kind of bringing that experience back into themselves
right,
and kind of reconciling it with the way they ultimately are going to be. And you bring up a really important point. I mean, for some people, it's very easy. For some people, the experience just makes a lot of sense to them. They kind of give themselves over to
right,
it. Sometimes, if it's a specifically in a specific religious context, maybe somebody was raised Catholic and they have this experience of God and Jesus that, it just makes sense with everything that they know.
right.
It's very easy.
Yeah,
On the other hand,
right,
there's certainly plenty of people like yourself who have an experience that is incredible, but doesn't always fit exactly with the way they think or the way they
right,
have been thinking.
right,
And sometimes it can be a challenge. And we talk about this, in the larger context of this field of neurotheology, that when you start to think about religious experiences and spiritual experiences, while they often can be very positive and wonderful, there can be a negative side, and sometimes it's a real challenge to integrate it into the way you think. Sometimes then you think, all right, well, I'll go and speak to a clergy member or something like that, and then you start to describe this experience to them, and then they kind of brush you off, or they tell you that's a wrong
right,
way of thinking. And then now you're or maybe you tell a family member, and they kind of give you the yeah there kind of thing, and so yeah, it can create a lot of struggle within a person. It can cause a lot of distress at times, and yeah, we definitely see that, even though the experience, even if the experience itself is enormously positive, sometimes there really can be
right.
a challenge at integrating it back into your
and
life.
and that goes back to this culture, because in this culture we build so many disciplines on the assumption that everything is a derivative of physical processes,
Right.
right? We just assume that matter is the fundamental ingredient of the universe, and everything is constructed from interactions within that domain. And then when you experience something that's so from the other end of the spectrum, it's like,
Mm.
oh no, matter is a complete illusion. You are just consciousness.
Right.
Sorry, you have believed you were a material thing. You're not. Like
Right.
that, and that is sort of like, it's so intense that I feel like a lot of people go to the mental hospital because of it, because they have a sudden enlightening experience that does not fit at all into the belief systems they were born into.
Right.
And
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you raise again some really important points, and to me this is part of what lies at the heart of neurotheology as a field, is the idea that how much can we attribute to the material world, how much goes beyond that, are there ways of looking at that in certain ways, and at the very least being open to both sides of that. Where how do they interact with each other? My late colleague and I, we used to talk about this all the time. That is it possible that matter and consciousness are sort of two sides of the same coin that depend on how we kind of look at it? That we find either a material presence in the world, or we find a more consciousness, subjective presence in the world. And it may very well have a lot to do with how we experience it and what we experience. And again, this is where maybe some scientific approaches, as well as keeping in mind the philosophical and the theological implications of all of this becomes very, very important. And hopefully, and part of what I try to do in my work is to encourage people to really explore those questions carefully. And whether you come at it more from a scientific perspective or more from a religious or spiritual perspective, that the other side still has a lot of important things to say, and we need to be careful about whatever conclusions we ultimately
Mm.
draw.
Yeah, I think just arriving, if this culture would arrive at a point of maybe, in the sense that both sides are looked at with a question mark,
Hmm.
it
Yeah,
would be very helpful.
right,
Just if the school system would admit we actually do not know where consciousness comes from, we have no
right.
idea whether God exists or not. We have, like, I feel like exploring the mystery with question marks is
Mhm.
could be so.
Well, absolutely. And to me, a lot of times people ask me, what's some of the most important things that I've learned in doing the work that I do, and I think that one of them is just what you said, that when we study people's brains, when we look at people's experiences across traditions and cultures and even times, I mean, there's so much diversity, and when you kind of think about what our brain is designed to do, and how it's basically trying to make some kind of sense out of a basically infinite universe, I think it's totally expected that each one of us would come up with a different perspective on what the world is. And
Right,
so it isn't surprising that somebody comes up with a Buddhist perspective and someone comes up with a Muslim perspective and a Catholic and an atheist perspective. Our brains are just struggling mightily against an infinite universe with this little pieces of information that we have and trying to tell us this is what it's all about. And
right,
so to me, that makes me a lot more forgiving of other people who have come to conclusions that are different than mine, because it's like, of course, it would be
right.
shocking if everybody came to the same conclusion.
Mm,
And given the way things are in the world today, I hope that this kind of perspective can be helpful at, like you said, making people realize that, maybe we have to be a little bit more appreciative of other ideas, open to other ideas, at least, not rejecting, and being perhaps more compassionate and understanding. Even if we ultimately decide that we want to believe the things that we do, at least we may have a little bit more compassion and understanding for the people who think about it, things in a different way.
yeah. It's almost like we are each our uniquely shaped filters that all filter certain frequencies, and these frequencies are our truths or our beliefs. So the
Mm.
things we latch on are sort of energies that pass through us, and through what we have experienced, we sort of create little peaks at certain frequencies, and that becomes our reality or something like that.
Sure. I mean, we,
And
we we bring to bear our genetics, our upbringing, our the teachers that we've had, ultimately the experiences that we've had, everything. I mean, I work in an integrative medicine center. The foods we eat, the toxins we're exposed to, the ideas that we're exposed to, and then somehow we put it all together into what seems like a reasonably coherent model of reality, and it's just that, it's a model.
mm, what I find so interesting about these spiritual experiences is that they're non-rational component.
Hmm.
Because in a way, you could say that when we create logical concepts, we string things together in a linear way, and and these spiritual experiences sort of disrupt this linear processing, and it feels
Yeah.
more that the unity underlying all could be experienced directly.
Mhm. Well, in our book, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, one of the things that we do talk about is what is going on in the brain. And there are a couple of changes that appear to go on in the brain that are very likely related to that issue that you mentioned. In fact, part of what seems to be happening is that certain parts of our brain, very important parts like our frontal lobes and our parietal lobes, they tend to start to shut down in their activity during these intense experiences. So if the parietal and the temporal lobes start to shut down, these are areas that are involved in our language areas and our abstract thought processes. And so if they're not working well, I shouldn't say it that way. If they're not functioning at the level that they normally function at, then the end result may be essentially an inability to describe something, an inability to understand
Mm,
something, and that sense, that paradoxicality, that inability, as you said, to sort of put things together in some kind of causal
right.
relationship. And of course, if the frontal lobes are shut down, then these are, this is an area of our brain that normally helps us to kind of control our thought processes and regulate the ways in which we think about things. So if that starts to change, then suddenly all the ways that we normally kind of order our world suddenly get kind of thrown up in the air. And again, the end
Right.
result is the idea that it doesn't. We really struggle to find a way of understanding what it is and how it works and what its meaning is. And so the fact that these changes are going on in the brain may have a lot to do with that aspect of the experience, that ineffability, that indescribability, the paradoxicality of it.
Mm,
And it may have a lot to do with the fact that the areas of our brain that normally give us a sense of causality and help us to see how things fit together well, they seem to start to shut down. And so, again, this is how we might be able to use the science to help us understand the nature of the
mm.
experience.
Have you ever heard of Martin Shona? So his theory is that enlightenment or these altered states of consciousness or more evolved states of consciousness, however you want to refer to them, are essentially the brain optimizing its resonance patterns
Mm.
and finding common frequencies not just within the alpha and delta waves but also within the overtones generated by those fundamental brain waves.
Right. Yeah, I mean, obviously we need to look at different theories and how things work. My work tends to be a little bit more in the imaging area, so
Yeah,
I'm not looking at the waveforms as much. But certainly, there's been a lot of data that have looked at electroencephalography, EEG,
yeah,
and try to understand that kind of thing. And he obviously was able to kind of look at it in a bit of a novel way, but one of the things I wrote a book called Principles of Neurotheology, and one of the points I make is that one of the principles is that we need to be open to alternative methodologies.
right,
And just because I have an MRI machine doesn't mean that an MRI machine is the best thing to use for everything.
right.
The proverbial, if all you own is a hammer, then everything starts to look like a nail. So if
Right.
I think that while the work that I do, which is looking at the changes that are going on in the brain, are relevant, I am aware of some of the changes that have been observed looking at EEG patterns and electrical activity. I think part of what we ultimately need to do is continue to see, how that works and to see whether or not we might be able to link up those kinds of changes with what we're seeing in the brain itself and what that may mean. Is the brain receiving a frequency? Is it generating a frequency? Is it resonating with something outside?
Mm,
Um, to some degree, we all do that. If we're all singing together, then we all start to feel a coherence, and there's evidence to show that when people are in some kind of interpersonal resonance, that their brain sort of reacts the same way.
right.
So and that's the very basis of things like rituals, which again is another huge area of work that a lot of work has already been done. Probably more work needs to be done, but we've talked a lot about it in our work about the importance of how rituals help to entrain the brain processes and the brain rhythms as a way of inducing these different kinds of states and experiences. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that there should be ways of measuring that. Whether this particular
Right.
researcher was doing it the best way or the right way, I don't know. But it certainly makes a reasonable sense that we would be able to see these kinds of patterns.
Yeah. Yeah, I found it fascinating because it also sort of tied into music because what we experience as pleasant music is harmonious music, which
Right.
means that all the waves line up. For example, a fifth C and G is like one of the most consonant intervals. While the C vibrates twice, the G vibrates three times. So after three or two waves, they all line exactly up.
Mm.
And we find this structure or yeah this pattern of coherence within all harmony. So when an
Right.
instrument is tuned correctly, it's because the waves line up.
Right.
And that's exactly the principle he discovered in the brain waves of people that experience bliss, is that their
Hmm.
waves are lining up all the overtones in regular intervals.
Right.
And that was fascinating, that sort of the the subjective experience of beauty, it can also be interpreted as the objective experience, the objective observation of resonance, of
Hmm.
harmonious resonance. So yeah, anyway,
But yeah, no, I mean, we talk a lot about music in our work, the different rhythms and how they drive our brain and our autonomic nervous system that regulates our whole body. And there's definitely this notion of how our body is kind of resonating with what is external. And again, there's this sort of reciprocal interaction. In fact, there's a rhythm in the ritual between what is going on inside and what is going on outside. And so, yes, I mean, whether it's music or art or some other type of creative process or a meditation or prayer,
mm,
that rhythmicity is something that is very, very important. And you can engender different kinds of experiences. So if you're talking about music, and if you want to engender an experience of a very, you know, profound sense of blissfulness or maybe the love of God or something like that, then you might have a very slow, melodic type of chant, very harmonious, maybe like a Gregorian chant or
mm,
something like that.
yeah,
And on the other hand, if you're getting ready to play a football game or something like that, then and you want to engender more of a feeling of energy, or maybe you want to feel God's power or something like that, then something that is very uplifting, very rapid, very higher pitched and so forth, could be something that really helps to energize a person.
mm,
And so and in fact, again, this kind of goes back to where research might be of value in saying something about, well, what are the most effective ways of creating these rituals? Up till now, most rituals have been developed more by just trial and error. Somebody tried something, or
right, right.
a rabbi or a priest said, "Hey, let's try this song," and afterwards, people came up and either said that was a great song or why did you do that? And if they said
Yeah,
that was a great song, then they did it the next time. And so, but with this, we theoretically can almost use an empirical approach and say, well, let's try these 5 different ways of doing a song and see which one, what's the one that really generates the chills and
right, and
makes
try
you
to
feel
measure
something.
that.
Yeah.
And switching the topic slightly, do you think that it matters whether we come to whether we determine if there is an objective truth to these experiences, or do you think the value in these experiences is really showing that there are tools to create the subjective experience of enlightenment? Do you know what I mean? Like whether really
Yeah.
enlightenment exists, whether God really exists, that might be
Right.
quite unprovable.
Right.
But does it matter? You
Right.
know?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, in the grand scheme, yeah, sure, it matters. Yeah, it'd be nice to know for
Right.
sure that, something that we're doing, or if we believe in God and God truly exists, it'd be great to know that for sure. On the other hand, your point is very well taken, that from the perspective of our brain and the way we feel and the way we interact with the world, the degree of accuracy is not always as crucial as what it does for us. And
Effectiveness.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, when you do get down to it on a very kind of evolutionary level, a very biological level, our brain is not really as interested in accuracy as it is in adaptability. And the example I always use is that if you're, imagine a human ancestor walking around the jungle or something like that, and you hear a snap of a twig, if you run because it could be a lion, then you're safe and your brain has been adaptive. It has allowed you to survive. Now, if it had been, a small rabbit and you could have had something to eat, well,
Right.
you missed out on your chance. But it was far more important that you didn't get eaten, and so your brain cared more about not worrying about the accuracy of what was going on, but just whether or not it was able to
Right.
keep you alive and functioning properly. So, we see this over and over again in humanity and how we interact with each other. So oftentimes conflicts arise because people thought somebody meant something or said
Right.
something that they
All the
didn't
time.
all the time.
Right.
And so again, I think part of what comes out of this data is to say, we should strive a little bit more for accuracy, but we should also recognize how our brain is operating, and that the subjective experience of enlightenment or mysticism can be far more important. And maybe if it's real enough for the person, that may be very well be the best way to define what is real. It may be. We may never get at, as you said,
Right.
what is the, sort of the
Because
true physical nature of the world.
right, because there's always the question: is there really a true physical nature of the world?
Mhm.
Because like quantum physicists have been discovering in the last couple of decades, the observer changes the outcome of a reality, whether it's measured, whether the data is collected in a double slit experiment, for example, whether the
Right,
photon is a wave or a particle.
right,
That
right.
so that those experiments show like, or really raise the question: is there really a fundamental physical reality, or
Right.
is the reality always dependent on the choices and the perception of the person engaging with that reality?
That's right. And I guess, my gut feeling is that it's probably a little bit of both. That there's certain aspects
Right.
of a physical reality that is
Or
also affected by consciousness, and vice versa. And again, I think that's where, a field like neurotheology is something that might really be able to help us with that, because we can kind of look at both sides, and we can be open to both sides, without necessarily negating the other one, and try to get a better feel for how we understand what reality actually is. I mean, in my sort of goal of goals, I hope that we may be able to figure out that sort of perfect blend of cognitive processing and contemplation with something biological and brain oriented, and maybe throw in something spiritual. I don't know where the exact combination is, but I sort of feel like if we just go down a religious or spiritual path, or if we just go down a
mm,
scientific path, we sort of, both paths miss something.
right.
And I think ultimately we need to figure out that sort of ideal approach that is a true hybrid, is a true combination that brings those two aspects together, because ultimately those two aspects appear to exist, and we need to try to figure out how best to get
Right,
at it.
because once you devise an experiments and observe the results, there's still the part of you that perceives those results and says, "Oh yeah, logically this must be true." But that's
Right,
the same part of you that gets its mind blown by some hyperdimensional divine energy that we experience as enlightenment, and says
right,
that is the ultimate truth, right? Like
right,
anybody that experiences an enlightened experience uh, comes back saying, "Oh, was way more real than anything I believed or experienced my entire life."
right.
And so that's an interesting position
Yeah.
to have, where you're verifying things with physical experiments, and then you are just experiencing something purely subjective, but it's so much more powerful. And yeah, integrating
Well,
those.
and we documented that very statement that you made. I mean, we asked people in our survey of spiritual experiences, how real did it feel? And as you mentioned, I mean, the overwhelming majority of people, 90% or whatever, felt that it was more real than our everyday reality experience, which is where science exists. And so,
90%.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it was just, incredibly powerful of an experience. And um and and I think part of what that ultimately, part of where we went with this, if neurotheology is something, then this is sort of neuroepistemology. But we're talking about how our brain recognizes what is real, or identifies something to be real. And part of the answer is we don't know. We don't know why our brain says that certain things are real and other things are not real.
Right.
If I were to if I were to tell you I have a little green gremlin sitting on my shoulder, you would say, "Well, that's ridiculous." But but I think that so when people say, yes, I had this spiritual experience, I touched a spiritual plane, I touched God, what that was extremely real to me. If we are sort of forever trapped within our brain, and always just sort of looking out at the world, then there is no real way of ascertaining what is real other than our sense that it is real. And if that's the case, then these kinds of mystical enlightenment experiences typically win out over our everyday reality experience. And which, then I always say,
Right.
well, doesn't that mean we have to really pay attention to them? Again,
Right.
it may not, it may not help us to absolutely determine what is real and what is not, but it certainly means that it's a far more complicated question than those people who are purely materialists saying it's just all matter, or those people who are purely spiritualists who are saying it's just God.
Right.
It's just some spiritual consciousness. It may be far more complicated than either of those perspectives.
And I think that is also the hard part of integrating these experiences, is they seem so real that it is then hard to contain them without certainty. Or like, I think a lot of people have these experiences and then jump to the conclusion that Jesus must be real, or Muhammad must be real, or whatever their
Right.
interpretation, their religious interpretation was.
Mm.
And I feel like, yeah, that's also a very hard thing to do, is to like have this experience and be like, okay, let me just let this rest there, and not have to jump to a conclusion.
Right. Well, and again, I mean, I think that that's something that is an important outcome of this overall body of work, which is to say we have to be careful of conclusions. And just because somebody feels something is real doesn't mean that it is, but it also is something that we need to look at.
Right.
And just because we may have a brain scan study that says that this is what happens when somebody experiences enlightenment, that doesn't mean that that's what enlightenment is defined
Right.
as.
Right.
Doesn't
It
so
doesn't mean that the neurological processes are the cause of enlightenment. It
exactly.
could also be just an effect of something that happens in consciousness, which isn't precisely measurable.
Absolutely. And there's even a flip side to that, which is, even if it was, does that mean that it negates the value of the experience? It's like saying, even if I could figure out exactly what areas of your brain enable you to enjoy music, and enjoy Mozart or whatever whatever you play, that doesn't mean you stop playing it. It doesn't mean,
Right.
if I could tell you what areas of your brain
Right.
light up
It's like,
when you
okay,
see
yeah,
when you
life
see
is
your
over. You figured me out.
right,
It's
right.
not
I
like
mean,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
if I could tell you what areas of your brain become activated when your child walks into the room or a spouse walks into a room and you feel love, that doesn't you don't say, oh, okay, well now I don't have to do it anymore. I mean,
Right. Right. That's a
so
good.
so there's still a lot of value to these experiences, no matter what the final
Right.
conclusion may be.
Right. Regardless how science figures them out or doesn't figure them out. Right.
Exactly. But
But
my
then,
guess is that they're going to be far more, especially when you're talking about spiritual enlightenment, that these are going to be far more complicated types of experiences, and that there is some interesting combination of both material and non-material elements that we need to do a better job at figuring out and
yeah.
understanding. And,
Hmm.
and we got a long way to go.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think this was a pretty nice discussion, and thank you so much for your
Great.
time. Um,
Well, my pleasure.
yeah, thank you. And maybe we can conclude with a quick exercise, like a meditation exercise, one of your favorite personal meditation exercises that you think can help people experience these things for themselves.
Um, well, I think for me, a lot of it is, a lot of my own work has been a more philosophical meditation, and I think, to be honest, I don't know if I could guide people through it so
Yeah.
much as to say, if you sit there and you rest with your thoughts and challenge your thoughts, why do I think the way I think? Just
Right.
keep asking questions.
Mm.
Why do I think that? Was that my idea? Was it somebody else's
Right.
idea? How do I know that it's real? How do I know that if you really keep pushing yourself down that path, you can get into some very interesting experiences,
Yeah.
and sometimes it's scary, and that's another thing I think people need to really be kind of okay with. We talk about that and how enlightenment changes your brain, the idea of preparing yourself for the journey and
Yeah.
and for the experience, because to have your whole world and your whole belief system turned upside down is no easy thing. And we were talking about
Yeah.
your experiences earlier, and
Right.
it's something that we really have to be sort of prepared for and okay with. We need to be open to it,
Yeah.
And then just sit there with our thoughts and reflect on them and reflect on their meaning. Always keep, to me, it's always keep pushing the questions, always keep challenging, and hopefully that leads to something good.
Yeah. And I think a thing I think I went on a similar path in that sense. Like that's how it's for me. It started also with very much um, just experiencing emotions and having thoughts, and then asking, what is the driving force behind this?
Mm-hmm.
And then sort of sitting with that and trying to experience like these driving forces that are sort of almost underneath the rational mind,
Right.
and
Yeah.
and sort of befriending them and breathing into them and accepting a general okayness and goodness beyond
That's right.
beyond the whole wind of personal perception.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And again, I think that sometimes where the scientific part helps out a little bit too, which is that maybe people can kind of, they don't feel like they're quote unquote crazy, that that there is something going on that has value and can be understood in different ways. I think sometimes that can be very helpful for people to know that there's more than one way to think about this and more than one way to experience it, and as you said, to be prepared and try to figure out the best way forward.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Andrew. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah,
so
this was
much.
great. We'll
Yeah.
have to stay in touch. Let me
Yeah.
know how it goes. I'm here in the Philadelphia area.
Yeah, and send me some links that I can tag in this video to you, or I just tag your website
Somewhat.
if you want. Do you
Yeah,
have a
I think
YouTube
that's
channel
what I
or?
got. I'm not as savvy yet on the internet as I should be.
Okay. Bye bye.
Oh, all right, take care.
Take
Thanks.
care.
Bye
Bye.
bye.